What's going on, everyone? This is Peter Jennings. I go by CSU Ram 88 across the daily fantasy industry. Excited to be doing another lineup review here on FantasyLabs.com. I originally planned on doing a preview of this big championship, but unfortunately I got very sick on Thursday, so I didn't have a chance to get it out in time. But very excited to be doing a review of the final 10 of the biggest fantasy football tournament ever. $15 million tournament with $5 million to first. A.E. Jones was fortunate enough to take it down. Very well respected DFS and poker player. Very nice guy and certainly well deserving. He's been grinding it out and is definitely a great player. Also, big time congrats to everyone who made the final 10 in this event. Certainly a big accomplishment there. And I can only imagine the sweat that these guys had watching each game take place and the 2-day sweat that it was. So let's start here at the bottom. We have Stucksy, which he just ran really, really bad with his lineup here. Obviously, took Aaron Rodgers in the double stack with Randall Cobb and James Jones. Randall Cobb got injured. James Jones put up a goose egg. So you play a quarterback with two receivers. Aaron Rodgers had a decent game, and he gets 0 out of both his receivers, which just killed his lineup. The running backs, David Johnson, James White. David Johnson was the absolute chalk play, almost a must play, and that's why he was 90% owned. James White, PPR play, not going to get a ton of carries, but has been really involved in the Patriots passing game. Just didn't quite get there, didn't get in the end zone, so not a great game from James White as well. And then Travis Kelce, Demaryius Thomas, and the Broncos D. Demaryius Thomas being 70% owned, who is one of the more obvious picks in my opinion, and then Travis Kelce at 40%. So unfortunate showing here, the double stack with Rodgers and Cobb and Jones. Just really unlucky for Stucksy here, but it is what it is, and I like the roster construction here. Definitely not a glaring mistake that I personally see, and a great pivot trying to come back on Kandia, who did have over a 26-point lead coming into this divisional round in the second part of this championship. I thought Aaron Rodgers was a good pivot, and the double stack definitely made sense. Moving to Corey 315, went with Cam Newton at quarterback, who ended up being 30% owned, which kind of surprised me going against Seattle. Definitely some upside with Cam Newton with the rushing ability, but a tough matchup. And also game flow really worked against him, so had a really bad game. Went with Cam Newton, Ronnie Hillman, David Johnson. Again, we talked about David Johnson. Michael Floyd, who was probably my favorite receiver on the slate for the price, who was fortunate to score 2 touchdowns. Tyler Lockett, Demaryius, Greg Olsen, Kelce, and Broncos D. The thing I noticed here is kind of went with a little bit of a game stack with Cam Newton and Olsen, and then Lockett coming back. Hopefully Cam Newton and Olsen connect multiple times, and Lockett can keep the game close. So I thought that strategy was interesting. Did like the running back combo of David Johnson and Ronnie Hillman. I thought C.J. Anderson would be more heavily owned, and Ronnie Hillman might have been a nice pivot there. So don't hate that, and I definitely think it's a nice tournament strategy going with Hillman. And then the Broncos defense I thought was the best play. So I like this lineup. Just didn't really have anyone go off, and Cam Newton was kind of a disappointment given that the Carolina was up 31-0 at half. You would have assumed Cam Newton would have put up a lot more fantasy points, but it was a Jonathan Stewart day. Moving to Kandia. Kandia probably had the most interesting decisions to make, given that he had a 26-point lead, and he really, you can identify kind of the chalk for the week, and you can kind of think about where are most people going to be targeting guys. What's the highest expectation lineup here? So he made some interesting decisions, and a couple of things I noticed about his lineup that kind of led me to believe I don't know if he was trying to protect his lead, but he definitely wanted to make sure he had exposure to a lot of different things to at least protect a top 3 finish, which is a 7-figure score. Kandia was fortunate enough to take third for $1 million, and big congrats for him. Played Carson Palmer, who I thought was the clear chalk at quarterback. I thought he'd be 60-70% owned in this tournament. I played him in my cash games and thought he was a no-brainer. Highest team total for Arizona against Green Bay at home, no weather, a lot of great receiving options. I really thought he was the best play. David Johnson again at 90%. He didn't care about the negative correlation with Palmer and David Johnson, which I didn't either. You can't really care too much about that. In a 4-game slate. And in addition to that, David Johnson is a pass-catching running back, so you still could get a, throwing touchdown from Palmer to Johnson, so I like that. Went with Fitzgerald Toussaint, which was a good play, I think, even against Denver's defense. Denver obviously It was a big favorite, low team total for Pittsburgh, but Toussaint was going to get a lot of opportunity, and running back was a very tough position, especially after David Johnson. So I think that made sense. The big killer for Candia was Randall Cobb, and for the three guys who had him, I thought he was going to have a great game. Jeff Janis came in his role, had a huge game. Just very unfortunate after making a miraculous play, Randall Cobb, that ends up not being ruled a catch. Randall Cobb, just 0 points. What are you going to do? Gets hurt, out for the game. Nothing you can change there. So that was unfortunate for Candia. Love the Julian Edelman call. I thought he was basically a lock as well. I had him in my cash games. Surprised he was only 40%. But people had a lot of reasons to pivot and do different things in this specific tournament here. So Julian Edelman, great play. Demaryius Thomas, 70% owned. I thought that was a lock as well. Really good price on him and a great matchup against Pittsburgh. And then Heath Miller was probably the most interesting pick on Candia's roster in terms of just one player. Very cheap, but definitely not the chalk play. Only 20% owned. Allowed him to get these stud receivers, Demaryius, Emmanuel, Edelman, Cobb, etc. So I like that. Then went with Emmanuel Sanders and Broncos D. Now, the one thing I think is really cool that Candia did here, that makes me kind of think he might have been protecting his lead, or at least trying to make sure he ensured that top 3 spot, is he had Palmer and David Johnson and no receiver stack with Carson Palmer. So he had the Arizona exposure, he got Pittsburgh exposure with Toussaint and Heath Miller, he got the Broncos exposure with Demaryius and Emmanuel, he got Patriots exposure with Julian Edelman, and he got Green Bay exposure with Randall Cobb. So he kind of got a lot of different options from different teams. In the event that someone went off, he at least had a piece of a certain combination going off. So I thought that was a really interesting strategy by Candia. And again, no quarterback to receiver stack. That's something I definitely would not do in a normal tournament, but given that he had a 26-point lead, maybe it was a really smart play. I definitely think it's interesting, and certainly Candia is one of the best players of all time, so I'm not going to second guess it, but very interesting that he kind of went this direction, getting exposure to all these different things. Box 97 with the lineup here, and I don't want to bash anything. All these guys did great. There was one play that I did not like in this tournament, and it was on Box 97's team. With Cam Newton, I don't mind that. Again, 30% owned. David Johnson was great. But the play I really hated was Spencer Ware. Very limited in practice throughout the week. I know he was active, but really risky play here. And again, not to pick on Box 97, but anytime you're in a big spot, or anytime you're playing a big tournament or a high buy-in tournament, it's normally not worth the risk to play someone who is really questionable, limited, and that was the case with Spencer Ware. Charkandrick West saw the majority of the carries, and Niall Davis was actually the backup. So that was the one play I was not a fan of. Only person who took Spencer Ware, but again, it is what it is, and the rest of the lineup definitely makes sense. Played with Martavis Bryant, 30% owned, Emmanuel Sanders, Greg Olsen, Ronnie Hillman, and Cardinals D. Like everyone else, Martavis Bryant was a polarizing pick for me, and I saw some really sharp people on him. I was not. I respected the Broncos' pass defense, but Martavis Bryant got a ton of targets, had to fill in for a lot of what Antonio Brown does, and had a huge game. So we'll talk more about that play, but that was one that I think some sharp people were on. Some sharp people thought it was not a great play, but it turned out to be a really, really good one. And certainly I saw some of the best players make it, so I'm convinced it was a good play. And maybe that's something that I should be doing more of. Maybe that's a leak in my game, is instead of worrying so much about a really tough matchup, understanding that, hey, if a player is in a spot where they're going to see just a ton of volume, ton of targets, and they're making up for a player being injured or whatever the circumstance may be, it's probably worth getting them in, especially a talent like Martavis Bryant, even in the event that they're in a terrible matchup. So we'll talk more about him. Martavis Bryant helped some people win some money this weekend. So great call there on Martavis Bryant. And I like the rest of the lineup here. We went with the Cam Newton, Greg Olsen stack. Moving to Dandy Don, who came in second place, had Cam Newton, C.J. Anderson, David Johnson. That was the chalk running back combo. Went away from Carson Palmer, who was the chalk to Cam Newton as a pivot, which I definitely don't mind. Had Doug Baldwin, Julian Edelman, Demaryius Thomas, Heath Miller, Michael Floyd, and the Patriots D. So like Candia, the other person on Heath Miller. Interesting thing here is no stack with Cam Newton, naked Cam Newton, which is fine. Even trying to make up points. Cam Newton has a lot of value with his rushing ability, so I think that certainly made a lot of sense to play him by himself. And also went with Doug Baldwin, potentially hoping for a little game stack there with Julian Edelman, Demaryius Thomas, and Michael Floyd. Those are my 3 favorite receivers all in my cash games this week. With Demaryius, Edelman, and Floyd, I thought they were really, really good plays. And then the Heath Miller spot is interesting just because so cheap, and obviously, that's how you normally want to attack Denver is with the tight end instead of the receivers because of the elite corners that the Broncos have. And then also went the Patriots defense, which I didn't mind at all at home. It's tricky knowing how to kind of attack Kansas City. Macklin being limited, you kind of thought they'd struggle to move the ball, but at the same time, Alex Smith doesn't really turn it over much. So a tough spot there, but the Patriots definitely at home was a nice kind of contrarian defense. I think Dan Dion probably thought some of these guys might be a little bit lower owned than they ended up being, but definitely a nice construction on the lineup here, and things just didn't break his way, especially with Cam Newton, who was just burned by game flow. So moving to Huggins, 8168. Russell Wilson, only one on Russell Wilson, which looked like a disaster and then turned out to be the number 1 scoring quarterback on the weekend. Game flow really worked in his favor, unlike Cam Newton. Played David Johnson, James White, Jared Abbrederis, which I really like that call. Only 10% owned, really cheap play. I thought he was going to be a target monster in that game. Was fortunate in terms of targets to see Cobb go down because that got him a lot more opportunity, but didn't really convert all those targets. 4 for 55 is not bad, but given all the opportunity, I thought Abbrederis would have an even better game. Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas, the 2 Broncos receivers, Travis Kelce, Julian Edelman, and Broncos D. Really like this lineup. I think it's well constructed here. James White just didn't quite perform. Not as many catches as you were hoping when you roster him. But Russell Wilson just with that huge game. And the other interesting thing here, yet again, we have a naked quarterback here, no stack with Russell Wilson. And I think that's fine with a running quarterback, just like Cam. I would prefer to stack Russell Wilson with someone, but definitely not an heir by any means because he has such upside with his running ability. Going to Rockin' Raven here, went with Carson Palmer, David Johnson, Fitzgerald Toussaint, Doug Baldwin, Michael Floyd, Emmanuel Sanders, Greg Olsen, and James Jones and Broncos D. We talked a lot about these players. I thought it was interesting that basically he kind of stacked a variety of different things here with Palmer, Floyd, David Johnson. I like that. And also had James Jones hoping for kind of a game stack. James Jones coming from behind. James Jones was just an unfortunate bust, had been great all year, and then just gets totally shut down by Arizona. So that really hurt Rockin' Raven, but the rest of the lineup really well done, and all the picks definitely made sense to me here. Moving to Under Jones, who is known as a contrarian player, always looking for the leverage play. Really impressed with Under Jones' play and everything in daily fantasy. And if you're looking for someone to kind of review lineups on, if you're a tournament guy, Under Jones might be at the top of the list, one of the best DFS players out there. Went with Aaron Rodgers as a leverage play here against Carson Palmer. I think everyone was probably surprised to see Carson Palmer only 40% owned. I like that call quite a bit. Got burned with Randall Cobb just like Condia, but the rest of the lineup really worked out. The leverage play here was Richard Rodgers at tight end on the double stack. Could have had a really big game against the Arizona Cardinals, which made sense with the double stack here. Also in Doug Baldwin, Julian Edelman, and Martavis Bryant. Again, great play there. That's why I have to kind of look more at that. A lot of sharp people on Martavis Bryant, and maybe that's just the biased Bronco fan of me overestimating how good our secondary is. But great call there, and then the Patriots defense as well. So well-constructed lineup, of course, and the leverage play here was the double stack with Aaron Rodgers against Arizona. And the one thing I think that really gives that a lot of merit is we've seen data that quarterbacks who are playing from behind actually perform much better. That happened here again this week with Russell Wilson, and Carson Palmer ended up doing well when they were behind with Arizona. So great plays here. I definitely like this team quite a bit, and Under Jones, big-time congrats on finishing fourth. Danny 1, 2, 3, 4. This lineup was off to such a hot start with Rob Gronkowski at only 10%, which is crazy. That's just a great play. I should have had more exposure to Rob Gronkowski myself in tournaments this week, but ultimate leverage play. Gronkowski, one of the best fantasy players ever. Had all these injury concerns, hadn't been playing that well lately. Had a tough matchup against Kansas City, but all that stuff goes out the window when it's playoffs, and you have Tom Brady, Belichick. They're going to figure out how to get him the ball, and he's just the ultimate red zone threat, and he had a huge game with 2 touchdowns. Really like the rest of this team as well. Carson Palmer, CJ Anderson, Steven Jackson, who's only 10% owned. I didn't mind that play. Minded a little bit more since he already had Gronkowski, but if you expect the Patriots just to roll, which he did with the Patriots defense as well, I think it's good. I thought Steven Jackson would have an even better game. Definitely was involved. Just they threw the ball quite a bit that game, and he didn't get quite as many opportunities as you would hope if you were a Steven Jackson owner. But really cheap and allowed him to get Doug Baldwin, Larry Fitzgerald, who had that huge game. He was a big reason. He was in second place here for Danny, 1, 2, 3, 4, and a critical guy to own, who we'll talk about more in a second. With that huge game, including that overtime where he had the big catch and then the touchdown as well. So great lineup here. John Brown and Larry Fitz is the double stack. I thought this team was really well constructed. A lot of upside. Gronkowski was a nice contrarian play, and really, paying up to be contrarian with a great player like him makes a ton of sense. And this was a great lineup. Danny gave himself a great chance to win, and big time congrats on the second place finish here. A.E. Jones, the champ. And just a beautiful lineup. It's easy to say now it's my favorite lineup, but definitely from a roster construction standpoint, I think this is just a brilliant job. Palmer, I would have played Palmer in this spot no matter where I was. I decided it was by far the best play, and I thought some people might get contrarian and make leverage plays to take a chance at first, which makes him lower owned, and that's what happened. Only 40% owned, much lower than I would have thought in this tournament. With C.J. Anderson and David Johnson, both really, the chalk running backs. Then Larry Fitzgerald, Michael Floyd, with a double stack for Carson Palmer. Larry Fitzgerald obviously being the huge difference maker. That's what catapulted Danny and A.E. Jones into first and second. Demaryius Thomas, loved that call as well. Travis Kelce was chalk and a great play. And then Martavis Bryant on the winning team. Clearly very sharp and, huge score here, 163 points. To catapult A.E. Jones into first place. So really interesting week. I hope we see some other stuff like this in the future. I think this is a nice twist on DFS where you have like these different contests where scores carry over, and you have a lot of different things to think about in terms of game theory. And on a 4-game slate, I think all these competitors and contenders did a great job making their teams. Certainly was fun to sweat it. We're just going to take a look here at the contenders' home. Again, you can see their scores from the first round and then their second round here. A.E. Jones in first, Danny in second, Condi in third, Under Jones in fourth, Rockin' Raven in fifth, Huggins in sixth, Dandy Don in seventh, Box in 8th, Corey 315 in 9th, and Stuxy in 10th. So congrats again to all these players. Certainly a lot of fun. I can only imagine how much of a sweat it was with all these games taking place over 2 different days. I just can't imagine. It must have been absolutely crazy. And definitely a fun NFL season. So I will probably be done doing lineup reviews for the NFL season, but we'll be doing them in basketball. I would love feedback on anything that you guys would like to see. I really want to get into a routine here, and it's going to be a lot easier with everything slowing down in terms of football being over and less sports going on. So thanks again for checking this out, guys. Hope to see more Fantasy Labs members at top of the leaderboard.